Overnight, the United States carried out strikes in Venezuela and captured President Nicolás Maduro. It was just before dawn on January 3rd, 2026. Explosions rocked Caracas, an attack that President Donald Trump swiftly claimed as a large-scale strike by U.S. forces capturing Venezuela's embattled President Nicolás Maduro, and noting that they have flown him out of the country. As shrapnel rained down on the capital and surrounding provinces, world leaders have scrambled to respond. How unprecedented is this? What do we really know about the assault's circumstances, casualties, and its justification as a narco-terror operation? We'll also discuss what will it mean for Latin America's stability and the U.S. influence abroad. In this episode of Arms and Arguments, we dig deeply into the facts and implications of the January 3rd action, drawing on reports from Reuters, The Guardian, and other international sources to cut through the fog of propaganda. Let's first discuss who is Nicolás Maduro. Was he president? Was he a drug kingpin? Was he both? To understand this event, we need to know who Nicolás Maduro is and why Washington invoked the language of narco-terrorism to describe him. Maduro, who was a former bus driver and a labor union activist born in 1962, he was handpicked by Hugo Chavez to take over as his successor, and that happened in 2013. He quickly became Bolivarian revolution. The economy under Maduro's rule, the economy has cratered into hyperinflation, and chronic shortages. Elections have widely been condemned as rigs. Hundreds of opposition figures jailed, and millions of Venezuelans have fled abroad. This year, he even claimed a third term after a 2024 vote that international observers denounced as a sham. Maduro's critics, especially in Washington, have long accused him of turning Venezuela into a narco-state. U.S. officials point to a sprawling drug trafficking network led by Chavez-era generals, the so-called Cartel de los Soles, which allegedly floods U.S. streets with cocaine. In 2020, the U.S. Justice Department formally indicted Maduro, who was then president, and 14 of his associates on narco-terrorism and drug trafficking charges. Attorney General William Barr declared that Maduro and his cronies had for years conspired with Colombian guerrillas, the FARC, to use Venezuelan territory as a coca trafficking network route into the U.S., very deliberately deploying cocaine as a weapon, which was used against American communities. Maduro and his team vehemently denied those charges. Last August, in fact, the U.S. doubled its reward for Maduro's capture to $50 million for his drug-related offenses. In the days before the strike, U.S. officials repeatedly labeled Maduro as a drug kingpin. Secretary of State Marco Rubio flatly called him the head of the Cartel de los Soles, narco-terror responsible for drug shipments into the U.S. President Trump's own post accused him of running a narco-state and pushing drugs into the United States. Maduro, by contrast, always said Washington's real motives was to seize Venezuela's vast oil reserves, which Venezuela does hold the world's largest proven oil reserves. In short, Maduro is a former union leader turned autocrat presiding over what the U.S. government has repeatedly branded a narco regime. These charges set the stage for action, but they also raise a critical question. Was there any legal or historical precedent for a direct U.S. military assault aimed at a sitting president? The January 3rd operation, the facts on the ground that have been confirmed in the early hours of January 3rd. The pre-dawn attack. Around 2 a.m. Venezuelan time, Venezuelans reported multiple explosions and the sound of helicopters and aircraft over Caracas and other states. Videos verified by Reuters shows fires and billowing smoke at strategic points, notably the port of La Guaira to the north and the Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base in eastern Caracas. Overhead radar confirmed Venezuelan airspace was silent. Witnesses saw troops guarding the empty streets around Miraflores Presidential Palace. In some, the U.S. had conducted a broad strike on the capital's military and allegedly civilian targets. The U.S. aims and admissions. By morning, President Trump had publicly claimed credit. On Truth Social, he announced that the U.S. had successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, and that Maduro, along with his wife, was captured and flown out of the country. He promised a press conference with further details. U.S. officials later confirmed that the operation involved elite Delta Force commandos and special operations teams acting in concert with the U.S. law enforcement. These forces seized Maduro and reportedly First Lady Celia Flores without explaining where exactly or how. Republican Senator Mike Lee even wrote on social media that Secretary Rubio told him Maduro would stand trial for criminal charges in the United States. In Washington's telling, a dictator indicted as a narco-terrorist has finally been brought to justice, at least out of power. The Venezuelan government's response. Caracas immediately called it outright military aggression. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded proof of life and has said she had no idea where Maduro was. Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez denounced the raid as deplorable and criminal, declaring it the greatest outrage the country has ever suffered. In a video addressed, he urged citizens and soldiers alike to form an indestructible wall of resistance. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello appeared on TV in combat gear, telling people not to cooperate with terrorist enemy. The government broadcast images of burning wreckage at Fuerte Tiena, Venezuela's largest military base, and other sites. In parallel, state media confirmed that Caracas and at least 3 states, Miranda, La Guaira, and Aragua, were attacked. Casualties. Both sides acknowledged there were deaths, but the toll is unclear. Maduro's ruling party admitted that civilians and soldiers were among the dead, though no independent count is available. Pedrino Lopez said authorities were still trying to calculate how many civilians had been killed and how many were injured during helicopter attacks in urban areas. Later reporting noted that the whole neighborhoods in South Caracas had lost power. The U.S. assault included gunships striking densely populated areas. Reuters quotes from the defiant Pedrino indicate civilian areas were hit. A U.S. attack on the country in the early morning struck civilian areas, he said, and Venezuela is compiling information about dead and injured people. Humanitarian groups on the ground warned of chaos. Residents hunkered down at home for safety, fearing looting and further violence. In other words, this was not a precision raid on a remote target. Caracas itself, a city of 2 million, was under fire. Civilian harm appears significant, though exact numbers aren't public yet. What's confirmed? In summary, by mid-January 3rd, we have hard evidence that 1. The U.S. carried out a broad military strike on Venezuela, including Caracas. 2. Maduro was indeed seized and removed from power. And 3. Both sides claim justifications. The U.S. invoking drug trafficking allegations, Venezuela invoking national sovereignty and denouncing an imperial assault. To recap, the key confirmed details, consider this rundown. The U.S. struck multiple targets around Caracas, anti-aircraft sites, presidential palace, an air base, and other locations, with helicopters, jets, and ground forces at about 2 a.m. on January 3rd. President Trump immediately announced Maduro's capture and removal, saying he was captured and flown out of the country after a large-scale strike. The U.S. sources confirmed Delta Force commandos were involved. The Venezuelan government confirmed the city and that nearby states had been attacked, calling it military aggression and vowing to resist. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez demanded proof of life for Maduro. Defense Minister Lopez urged people to unite to resist, and Interior Minister Cabello broadcast street defenses against the terrorist enemy. Venezuelan officials say both civilian and military casualties have occurred, although no official figure has been released. The defense minister said helicopters had struck urban areas and the authorities were still tabulating the dead and wounded. As these facts emerge from multiple independent reporting outlets, but the legal and historical context raises profound questions. When was the last time the U.S. openly launched a combat operation inside a Latin American capital to oust a president? Was this unprecedented, or does it show a historical pattern? In raw terms, this kind of operation is virtually unprecedented in recent decades. January 3rd assault marks the most direct American military intervention in Latin America since 1989. In fact, Reuters reminds us that it's the first time Washington has deployed U.S. troops on foreign soil in the Americas to depose a head of state since 1989 invasion of Panama. In that case, U.S. troops overwhelmed General Manuel Noriega, who was indicted in the U.S. on drug charges, and brought him to justice, a striking parallel to the present situation. Yet this wasn't a full-scale invasion of Panama's cities. It instead was a surgical strike of special forces and air power executed covertly and without prior congressional authorization. Back in 1989, Congress did authorize force. This time there was apparently no declaration of war or warning beyond a last-minute Twitter post. Many observers see echoes of Operation Gideon, which happened in April 2020. The bungled incursion by Venezuelan dissidents with some U.S. backing, except now it's been executed successfully on a much larger scale by American soldiers. Is it part of a historical pattern? Latin America has long been a theater of U.S. influence. Coups in Guatemala, Iran, Chile, Grenada, military flights over Belize and Nicaragua, and economic sanctions on Cuba. However, those Cold War and post-Cold War interventions were usually clandestine or indirect, often backed by local proxies. Here, by contrast, is an overt military seizure of a foreign president in peacetime. Even in the so-called war on drugs, the U.S. rarely sends troops across borders. Noriega in 1989 remains the closest. In short, this operation stands out. It is marketed as counter-narcotics actions, a continuation of the U.S. efforts to dismantle the alleged drug networks in Venezuela, but in scale and audacity, it is closer to regime change operations. Trump himself emphasized the parallel to Panama. We have successfully carried out a large-scale strike on Venezuela and its leaders, President Nicolás Maduro, he said, noting that the U.S. had not taken such direct intervention in its own backyard since overthrowing Noriega. By those words, American officials seem to be saying this is not routine, it's historic. Yet Venezuela's geography and the global context make a difference. Latin America isn't Europe or Asia. There are no nearby NATO commitments, no U.S. military bases right next door, aside from Colombia, which famously cut ties when Trump took office in 2017. And with Trump back in the White House, the allied populists like Argentina's Milei in power, a bold move was ideologically implausible. Still, for many, it conjures a nightmare of big stick diplomacy and reckless adventurism. The humanitarian cost in Venezuela. Even before the strike, Venezuela was in dire humanitarian condition. The UN reported that by late 2024, roughly 82% of Venezuelans were living in poverty. 53% in extreme poverty, unable to even buy basic food. Millions have already fled from political persecution and economic collapse. Now add military conflict to the list of daily dangers. Citizens awoke to find fighter jets overhead and bombs nearby. One retiree in Valencia, Maria Perez, described to Reuters how she climbed to her roof to see flares crisscrossing the sky, followed by explosions. We're worried about what's coming next. We don't know anything from the government, only what state television says, she said to Reuters. Others rushed to buy groceries and gasoline, bracing for potential looting or a longer siege. Some are celebrating, like a mechanic in Maracaibo, who cried tears of joy upon hearing the news via phone. But many were paralyzed by fear. For those on the ground, the immediate toll is tragic. Hospitals, soon to be overwhelmed with wounded, electrical grids and communication networks partially knocked out. The southern district of Caracas lost power for hours, according to Reuters. Food distribution, which already precarious, will likely be further disrupted. The psychological impacts are enormous. Venezuelans have known war and instability, but the brutality of seeing their own cities bombarded is new. Quantifying civilian casualties is difficult in real time. Both sides only give partial figures. The Maduro government claims dozens have died, while U.S. press releases so far have only mentioned Maduro and his wife being captured. Nothing to do with troop losses or civilians struck in Venezuela. But the officials in Venezuela are emphatic. They have attacked us, but they will not vanquish us. Defense Chief Pedrino promises, even as he admitted his forces were still counting the dead. Independent observers have yet to access sites like. What is clear is that a strike of this kind in a densely populated area carries a severe humanitarian price. International law, including the UN Charter, stresses that any force must distinguish civilian from military targets. Yet Pedrino's statement explicitly cites civilian neighborhoods being hit. The United Nations and human rights groups are already warning that innocent families have been caught in the crossfire. Conditions on the ground remain volatile. Venezuelan borders are on alert. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro has mobilized his army and called an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Nearby nations have closed ports and airports to avoid spillover. Meanwhile, one legitimate humanitarian concern is the potential for a surge of refugees fleeing the chaos. Already, some embassies are scrambling to help their nationals get out. In short, for ordinary Venezuelans, this attack compounds an already disastrous crisis. As one scholar put it before the raid, Venezuela was already in a fragile, almost frozen humanitarian state. Now it risks crack-ups, lawlessness, and even a humanitarian emergency. UK distanced itself in the diplomatic ripples. One of the most striking international reactions came from Britain's new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Within hours, Starmer was at a podium in London stressing that we were not involved in any way in this operation. He said bluntly that he wanted to establish all the facts, and he plans to call President Trump to find out exactly what happened. In other words, the UK was keen to avoid any hint of complicity, a sharp break from the previous conservative government's pro-Trump stance on Venezuela. Starmer invoked international law. We should all uphold international law, he said. Until he understood the full picture, he would neither condemn nor endorse the U.S. action. This UK reaction is diplomatically significant. Britain has been a staunch U.S. ally on sanctions against Maduro in recent years. But now Starmer clearly realized that a flagrant military strike on a sovereign nation is legally and ethically explosive. By distancing the UK, he signaled that even allies must be cautious. There's a former human rights lawyer, and he made clear he believed in legality over expediency. He noted that Britain's foreign office was working to keep British nationals in Venezuela safe. A subtle reminder that chaos could threaten civilians of third world countries. Not everyone in the UK was so measured. Reform Party leader Nigel Farage, for example, argued that the U.S. action might be a good thing if it deters China and Russia. But mainstream UK politics has so far kept to Starmer's line of legal caution and fact-finding. The quick UK reaction demonstrates a key diplomatic point. This strike was not a multilateral effort. It was not authorized by NATO, not discussed at the UN, and even America's closest friends were caught by surprise. That isolation means the U.S. must now justify itself far more extensively on the world stage. If partners like Britain are publicly calling for inquiries, the blowback politically and legally will be far greater than immediate military gain. Russia and China, condemnation and consequences. It's not really any surprise to anyone that Russia has reacted with outrage. The Russian Foreign Ministry immediately condemned the attack as an act of armed aggression against Venezuela. Moscow's statement accused the U.S. of unfounded pretext for ideological animosity, insisting that the U.S. use force is a grave violation of international norms. Russian lawmakers, including Deputy Speaker Kosachev, likewise warned that the strike breaks international law and will isolate Washington. In short, Russia is treating this as a major and it has the power to escalate. Remember, Russia has troops and equipment in allied Venezuela. It could see this as casus belli to further boost its presence or challenge U.S. influence in the hemisphere. At the very least, the Kremlin will use this incident to rally its allies against a Western onslaught, just as it did over Ukraine. So what about China? Beijing has so far been more circumspect in public statements, but its position is relatively easy to infer from past policies. China is Venezuela's largest creditor, billions in loans for oil, biggest customer, importing hundreds of thousands of barrels daily, and has long championed a no-intervention principle. Last month, China's foreign minister stressed that Beijing opposes all forms of unilateral bullying and supports nation sovereignty. While that comment was in context of a U.S. blockade of Venezuelan oil tankers, the language is telling. China framed U.S. sanctions and blockades as unjust pressure of a sovereign OPEC ally. There's no doubt that Beijing will condemn the January 3rd strike as well, likely calling it a breach of sovereignty and demanding de-escalation. Indeed, Chinese state media has noted that several countries condemned the attack, listing regional powers like Cuba, Nicaragua, and even a hesitant Colombia. We have yet to see an official Chinese press release on January 3rd, but Beijing is likely consulting Moscow and other allies right now. The potential consequences may use this incident to push its Belt and Road and energy diplomacy in Latin America, positioning itself as a more reliable partner than the U.S. Economically, China could accelerate payments or cancel debts, but it must be careful not to provoke the United States tit-for-tat measures on Chinese assets. For now, Beijing must get back to diplomacy and legal norms and perhaps quietly tighten the grip on Venezuelan oil deals in retaliation to Maduro's government asks. In short, Russia and China are more unified than ever in portraying the United States as a global aggressor. Each sees an opportunity. Russia to reassert its military relevance in a Western Hemisphere, China to recruit new sympathies for its narrative of great power of a struggle. Both have seats at the UN Security Council, so we may see them veto any Western resolutions on Venezuela, further isolating the U.S. on a global stage. Regional backlash, allies and adversaries. In Latin America, reactions split largely along ideological lines. Leftist and centrist governments are uniformly condemning the strike as a violation of sovereignty. Brazil's president was strident. He said the bombing crossed an unacceptable line and was a grave affront to Venezuela's sovereignty, warning it sets a dangerous new precedent for global instability. Colombia's Petro echoed that by demanding an emergency meeting to safeguard peace. Chile's President Uruguay's Foreign Ministry, Spain, and the EU and the United Nations all called for de-escalation and adherence to international law. Even Mexico, which has avoided direct attacks on Maduro so far, strongly condemns the U.S. military action. By contrast, a few right-leaning populists hailed the action. Argentina's president, a political ally of Trump, posted in capital letters, "Freedom moves forward. Long live freedom, damn it." Ecuador's new president tweeted that the narco-Chavista criminals will finally collapse and offered Venezuelan opposition leaders his support. These voices see Maduro as a narco-dictator and cheered his removal, but they are in the minority in the region's diplomatic community. The Organization of American States, which includes both leftist and U.S.-backed governments, called for unity against the strike. In Latin America, the refrain is respect the UN Charter's ban on force. This split will strain inter-American bodies. Already, countries like Peru and Bolivia are talking about coordinated responses to limit U.S. reach. Regional superpowers, Brazil and Mexico, will likely lead a chorus demanding a peaceful transition through dialogue, not war. For Venezuelan opposition in exile, there is uncertainty. U.S. and European backers have long recognized rival claims to Venezuela's presidency. Now that Maduro is out of the picture, the question arises, who leads the transition? The U.S. Congress may be pressured to recognize an interim authority, perhaps led by a moderate, anti-Maduro figure. That could drive a wedge in politics in Venezuela. But even among opponents of Maduro, many fear a power vacuum, civil strife if the military splits or rogue elements fight on. The region faces the prospect of another failed state scenario, unless a clear process is agreed upon. Finally, consider U.S. credibility. Domestically, Trump's action has drawn sharp criticism. Senator Andy Kim, a Democrat from New Jersey, blasted the strike as a violation of Congress's war powers and said it does not represent strength, not sound foreign policy. He warned it sends a horrible signal by implying it's acceptable to target a foreign head of state and predicted it will further damage our reputation, which will isolate the U.S. These voices worry that without legal backing, the U.S. appears as a rogue actor, undermining the very anti-corporation, the very anti-corruption and rule of law message it claims to champion. Even among allies, U.S. moral authority takes a hit. Europe and Canada, while acknowledging Maduro's abuses, stopped short of backing military action. For months, they had hoped sanctions and diplomacy might force elections. Now they're confronted with war. Now they're doorstep. Officials in NATO capitals are privately concerned that this makes negotiations on other issues, the Iran nuclear talks, China, trade deals, Russia and Ukraine, even far more complicated. In sum, the political fallout is vast and unpredictable. On January 3rd, a flashpoint was reached: Latin America's sovereignty versus U.S. hegemony. The rest of 2026 will see whether this sparks wider conflict or forces a new political settlement. In any case, the era of quiet regime change in America is over. As one analysis put it, markets and governments now must grapple with headline risk in geopolitics that until now was almost unimaginable. Conclusion: a new chapter of uncertainty. As the sun set on that fateful Saturday, one thing was clear: the world's order had taken a jarring turn. The United States, for the first time in decades, openly sent its military against a neighboring government and succeeded in pulling its presidency into U.S. custody. Whether one views Nicolás Maduro as a tyrant or as a sovereign leader, the precedent is alarming. The echoes of this raid will reverberate far beyond Venezuela's borders, challenging the rules of diplomacy and warfare. We will continue to monitor developments, the fate of Maduro, the state of Venezuela's people, the response of courts and the UN, and the debates in Congress and capitals worldwide. We encourage listeners to ask questions, demand transparency, and weigh the moral and strategic stakes of such a dramatic action. One thing is certain: on January 3rd, 2026, a new and dangerous chapter begun, and its consequences will shape the future of Latin America and U.S. foreign policy for years to come.